The summer of 1944 brought a strange collision of worlds to the farmlands of rural Mississippi, where cotton fields stretched endlessly under a burning sun and a system of oppression as old as the nation itself held black communities in chains of poverty and ignorance. And somewhere in that landscape of injustice, a German prisoner of war named Friedrich Müller sat in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, and he looked out at the black women who worked the fields nearby, and he saw something that reminded him of his own captivity, and that recognition would set in motion a story of courage and education and human connection that defied everything the world expected. Friedrich had been captured in North Africa in 1943 during the campaign that broke the back of Rommel's Afrika Korps, and he had been transported across the Atlantic to one of the hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps that dotted the American landscape, holding nearly 500,000 German and Italian prisoners, and he had expected cruelty and deprivation, because that was what the propaganda had promised, but instead he found himself in Mississippi working agricultural labor alongside local civilians. And the treatment he received was better than many Americans received in their own country, and this contradiction haunted him. The camp was one of many established across the American South, where prisoner labor helped address the shortage of workers created by the war, and the German prisoners picked cotton and harvested crops and performed the back-breaking agricultural work that had always been done by black laborers. And Friedrich noticed immediately that the black workers who toiled in the same fields were treated worse than the German prisoners, and they were paid less and given fewer breaks, and spoken to with contempt that was never directed at the captured enemy soldiers, and this observation disturbed something deep within him. But what happened next changed everything, because Friedrich was not an ordinary soldier, and before the war he had been a teacher in Hamburg, specializing in mathematics and literature, and he had watched as the Nazi regime corrupted the educational system and turned knowledge into propaganda, and he had quietly resisted in small ways that had gone unnoticed. And now, in this strange corner of America, he saw another system of oppression, and another group of people denied the education that could transform their lives. And he began to wonder if he could do something. The black community near the camp lived in conditions that shocked Friedrich. Despite everything he had seen in the war, and their homes were shacks without running water or electricity, and their children attended schools that operated only a few months each year, and adult education was virtually non-existent, because the system was designed to keep them in poverty and keep them working the fields. And the idea of a black person receiving a proper education was treated as dangerous by those who benefited from their labor, and the laws and customs of Mississippi enforced this arrangement with brutal efficiency. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because among the black women who worked near the camp was a young woman named Beatrice Johnson, and she was 23 years old, and she could barely read her own name, and she had been born into a sharecropping family that had never escaped the cycles of debt and labor that kept them tied to the land, and she had dreams that went beyond the cotton fields, but she had no way to pursue them, and she had accepted that this was simply how her life would be. And then she met a German prisoner who looked at her and saw not a field hand, but a mind waiting to be awakened. The first contact was accidental, when Beatrice brought water to the work crews, and Friedrich spoke to her in broken English, thanking her with a courtesy that was foreign in that place where black women were invisible. And she looked at him with surprise, and something passed between them that was not romantic, but was perhaps more profound, and it was the recognition of one outsider seeing another. And Friedrich asked her if she could read, and she shook her head with shame. And he said words that would change her life, which were simply that he could teach her if she wanted to learn. And then something no one expected happened, because Beatrice said yes, and she began to imagine a different future, and she told other women in her community about the German prisoner who wanted to teach them to read. And at first they thought she was crazy, because the dangers were enormous, and if the white authorities discovered what was happening there would be consequences. And yet the hunger for knowledge was stronger than fear, and one by one other women expressed interest, and a plan began to form in the shadows of that Mississippi summer. The night classes began in August of 1944 in an abandoned barn a mile from the prisoner camp, and Friedrich had made arrangements with guards who could be bribed and who did not care what a German prisoner did with his evenings, as long as he returned before dawn, and he walked through the darkness, carrying books he had obtained through the camp library and pencils and paper he had saved. And when he arrived at the barn, he found 12 black women waiting for him, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope, and the education of Beatrice Johnson and her community had begun. Behind these ruins, a secret waited, because the barn became more than a classroom, and it became a sanctuary where women who had been told all their lives that they were worthless discovered that they were capable of anything, and Friedrich taught them their letters first, scratching in the dirt, when paper ran low, and teaching them to form the shapes that would unlock the world of written language. And the women practiced in secret during the day, hiding their knowledge from employers, who would have been furious to discover what was happening, and the sisterhood of learners grew stronger with each passing week. The curriculum expanded as the weeks turned into months, and Friedrich taught reading and writing first, but then moved into mathematics and history and geography, and he told them about the world beyond Mississippi and beyond America, and he showed them maps and explained how nations rose and fell, and he taught them about their own history, which had been deliberately hidden from them. And he explained that the condition they lived in was not natural or inevitable, but was the result of choices made by people who benefited from their oppression, and this knowledge was more dangerous than any weapon. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because Beatrice proved to be an extraordinary student, and within 3 months, she was reading at a level that would have taken years in a conventional school, and Friedrich recognized in her a fierce intelligence that had been waiting for this opportunity, and he began to prepare her to teach others, knowing that he would not be in Mississippi forever, and that the movement they had started would need to continue without him, and Beatrice accepted this responsibility with a seriousness that humbled him. The classes attracted attention from the wrong people in December of 1944, when a white farmer noticed that his black workers seemed different somehow, and he began to investigate, and rumors spread about secret gatherings and about a German prisoner who was doing something improper with colored women, and the camp commander received questions, and Friedrich was interrogated about his nighttime activities, and he denied everything, and the women denied everything, and the conspiracy of silence held because everyone understood what would happen if the truth emerged. The winter of 1945 was a time of fear and caution, and the classes became smaller and more secret, and they moved from location to location, never meeting in the same place twice, and Friedrich taught in whispers, and the women learned in shadows, and the urgency increased as news of the war's progress suggested that the German prisoners would soon be repatriated, and Friedrich worked harder than ever to prepare Beatrice and the others to continue the work without him. And the question of what would happen next hung over every lesson, like a gathering storm. The liberation of the camps in Europe brought the war to an end. But for the German prisoners in America, the transition was slow, and Friedrich remained in Mississippi through the summer and fall of 1945, and he used every moment to teach and to prepare. And when he finally received word that he would be shipped back to Germany, he gathered his students one last time in the barn, where it had all begun, and he told them that what they had learned could never be taken away, and that they must teach others, and that education was the key to freedom. The farewell was emotional beyond words, and Beatrice stood before the man who had changed her life, and she spoke to him in complete sentences with proper grammar, demonstrating the transformation that had occurred. And Friedrich wept because he knew that he was leaving behind something more important than anything he had done before or would do again, and the women gave him small gifts they had made, and he gave them the books he had collected, and promises were made to remember and to continue, and then he walked away into the darkness for the last time. Friedrich returned to a Germany that was destroyed and divided, and he spent years rebuilding his life and establishing a career as a teacher in what would become West Germany, and he married and had children and grew old. But he never forgot the women of Mississippi, and he never forgot Beatrice Johnson, and he wondered often what had happened to the movement they had started, and whether the seeds they had planted had borne fruit or withered in the hostile soil of American racism. Beatrice did not let him down, and she continued teaching in secret 4 years after the war, and she established a network of literacy education that spread through the black communities of Mississippi, and she trained other teachers and wrote simple textbooks and created a movement that operated in the shadows while the civil rights struggle slowly gained momentum. And when the freedom schools of the 1960s emerged, Beatrice was already an elder stateswoman of underground education, and her methods and materials were adopted by young activists who never knew where they had come from. The correspondence between Friedrich and Beatrice continued for decades, conducted through careful intermediaries and hidden addresses, because even after the war ended, the danger had not passed, and letters crossed the Atlantic carrying news of progress and setbacks, and of lives transformed by education, and of the movement that refused to die. And when Mississippi finally began to change in the years after the Civil Rights Act, Beatrice emerged from the shadows and began to teach openly, and she founded a community center that bore no name, but that everyone knew was the continuation of what had started in that barn. The reunion came in 1978, when Friedrich traveled to America for the first time since the war, and he was 70 years old and Beatrice was 57, and they met in the community center she had built, and around them were dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the movement they had created. And Friedrich saw doctors and teachers and lawyers and business people who had learned to read in secret classes, taught by women who had learned from Beatrice, who had learned from a German prisoner of war, and the chain of knowledge stretched back to that summer night in 19... The story became known in the years that followed, and historians interviewed Beatrice and Friedrich and the others, who remembered, and documentaries were made and books were written, and the improbable tale of the German POW who taught black women to read in secret night classes during World War II became part of the larger narrative of resistance and education and human connection that defines the best of human possibility. And the recognition came late, but it came, and both Friedrich and Beatrice lived to see their work acknowledged. Friedrich passed away in 1992 in Hamburg, surrounded by his family, and the news reached Mississippi, and Beatrice held a memorial service at the community center, and people came from across the state to honor a man most of them had never met, but whose impact they carried in their minds and their hearts. And Beatrice spoke about what he had meant to her and to the community, and she said that he had seen them when no one else would look, and that he had believed in them when no one else would, and that his faith had given them the courage to believe in themselves. Beatrice lived until 2008, and by the time she died, she had taught 3 generations of her community, and the literacy rate among black residents of her county had risen from less than 40% to over 90%. And the community center she had founded continued her work in young teachers, carried on the method she had developed, and her name was spoken with reverence by people who understood that freedom begins with the ability to read, and that one woman working in secret had changed the destiny of thousands. And so we remember Friedrich Müller now walking through the Mississippi night carrying books to a barn where women waited to learn, and we remember Beatrice Johnson sitting in the lamplight forming her first letters and discovering that she was capable of anything. Then we remember the sisterhood of learners who risked everything for knowledge, and we remember the decades of secret teaching that prepared the ground for the freedom movement, and we remember the reunion of 2 old people who had changed each other's lives. And we remember that education is the most dangerous gift and the most precious legacy, and we remember that across all the barriers of nation and race and circumstance, the human spirit can still find connection, and we remember that their story is our story, and that as long as we tell it, they will never be forgotten, and the light they carried through the darkness will continue to illuminate the path toward justice and freedom and the full realization of human potential.